Inconsistency in principle and contradiction within our lives. People are not just contradicting themselves, but are also living in contradiction to nature itself. Now, when I say this, and when I say anything on my channel or throughout my books or what have you, I too am prone to contradiction. I too am prone to inconsistency. The goal is to be consistent, to be accurate, to be clear and definitive as to what we are doing in this life. That's what it means to have a sense of direction, to know what you are doing and what world you are creating. If you want a better world or a world of a certain type, well, that would be the goal, is to find and align to that direction. When you say a certain type, really let me know what that type is. Does it align to nature would be my biggest question. Because you can live consistent with your principles and yourself, but do you live consistent with others in their principles and their selves and their environment? Because some sense of reciprocity is necessary in this process. I'm going to use a number of examples here. First, and I'm going to make them somewhat relatable, things that are going on in the current world, which I don't always have to do in light of understanding nature, but for the sake of this video, I will do so, for the sake of comprehension, for the sake of symptom management, and then looking past into the root cause. For example, Andrew Tate. This is an individual that a lot of the internet has sparked a lot of fire and controversy about, almost as if he was put on the main stage and said to be this person that is banned and not being able to be accessed on any platform, yet everybody's reposting his content. Regardless, we have an individual who claims that you can gain a lot of money, you can be successful, you can be the alpha male, while he obsesses with material things, his cars, his successes, his money, and says, well, you can make a lot of money. And then in the next interview, he says, well, money is the root of all evil. It's what the Matrix created. It's what the elites created to control the people. They control them through the belief in money. Well, I would agree with that. However, when you live in contradiction, you are attaining money and seeking money through so many different ends, while saying it's the greatest evil. Now you can make a justification and say, well, what if the money is to achieve this and achieve that? He's still focusing on the material ends of it. And that is the issue. And then even to judge people by their titles or just by their identity also proclaims a low level of spiritual vibration, may you say. It looks at people in a lower way, not a higher way. Because if we were to look at people in a higher way, we'd say, hey, we're all human beings, we're all in the capacity to know right and wrong, we're all in the capacity to self-govern, to control ourselves. And self-control is self-mastery. We got to figure that out for ourselves. It starts with thinking for ourselves, to find ourselves, as Socrates would say. But there is one contradiction, right, where you have this material fixation in your own life and then saying, well, it's the greatest root of all evil. The church does this all the time. And there's countless examples of people living in contradiction, particularly with consumerism and materialism. And this is why you also have religions or certain ideologies come from this, saying, well, you don't need any materials, you don't need to consume anything, don't do anything. And you start to create extremes. I've talked about this in my interview with Nathan Cranby. Check it out in case you're interested, where we go over this whole idea of extremeness. But it has to do with inconsistency, it has to do with contradiction. And that allows division, that allows psyops, it allows people to infiltrate easier and say, well, you have this group and that group. Another example of inconsistency, not to get off track, would be Joseph Campbell. He's a doctor online who originally said, hey, everybody's got to, get what's going on in the mainstream. They got to do the mainstream narrative. He looked at his own studies and he was looking at all the science, always looking at the science, trying to depend on the science for what's the trustworthy answer. He's saying, trust the experts. And then, give him 2 years after that, he says, oh, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have trusted them as much as I have, and there's actually a lot of studies that are contrary to this, and we got to be careful. So here you see the inconsistency, and this is where it really comes in. If you're going to claim money is the root cause of the problem, as in the case of Andrew Tate, which, by the way, that's also a problem, saying money is a problem, because equally you can say money is power, but money can help you gain power. power is a separate scenario. It's like people giving money to politicians or for a certain law. But if people don't believe in that way of power, then money is just a form of what you get as the fruits of your labor and as the products, whatever. Whole separate conversation where you can have more contradiction, because people just want to say money is all evil. It's like, no, not money is all not evil, because it represents what you gain for what you do. But within itself, it is a man-made thing to represent something that is higher. Okay, so we can look at that higher thing itself, that being love, happiness. People look at money and these material things as the medium to get to that. That's the problem. Inconsistency. If you want to be consistent, say, I want to be happy, then be happy. If you don't want to be consistent, then have a material thing or a medium in between that, saying, I need this, even though it's completely the opposite of what it is. Okay, because you're saying, well, money was created, it's this dirty, filthy thing that corrupts people, but we need that for happiness. It's like, okay, so you need corruption for happiness. You need a man-made thing for something that is natural. Now you start to create a very dangerous scenario. I talked about this in my interview that I did with Awaken Your Mind. Check it out in case you're interested, talking about naturosophy. But when you have a doctor or somebody who's a scientist really focused on the studies, and he says, man, we got to trust the experts, he's not living his life by principle. He's living his life by what the studies and the details show him. And I'm not trying to have biased views of these individuals I'm mentioning. I'm saying simply based on how they are acting. They are not acting on principle. Because if you acted on principle and said, oh, well, a vaccine is man-made, it's unnatural, it's not, nature didn't give it to us, that's a principle, right? Or to say, well, people got to make up their own minds and we should always look out the other side, and the word conspiracy theorist is something that people do use to defame others and trying to look at every angle, okay? But oftentimes people fall for the agendas in this world, and he fell for that agenda because he didn't have an underlying principle that was of greater worldview saying, wait, it's unnatural, so why should I do it? Ever. It doesn't matter what the justification is. It doesn't matter what studies are out there. If it's not something that human beings should do, they shouldn't do it. But if you don't have that principle, then guess what? You're going to be prone to saying, well, it's just one drink. Oh, it's just one gamble. Oh, it's just one thing. I have control over that. But you don't have a grounding principle to say you do have control over it, because you're not saying it's universal. You're not saying you should always apply it. You're saying there's exceptions here and there. Oh, I could be honest, but not always honest. Murder is wrong, but murder is okay in this scenario. It's like, no, okay? You have to be very principled with what you do in this life. Otherwise, you're going to get yourself in trouble, and you're going to go in paths that you don't want to be in, even though you yourself somewhat know that you shouldn't go down that path. So again, that's where you have a contradiction between yourself and a contradiction between yourself and the natural world, which is every sort of conflict in this world. It comes down to the natural and unnatural. I'm going to bring this back in because you're going to see how essential it is. If I look at politics, people are all thinking that their way is the best. And people will even look at what I talk about with politics and say, well, you think your way is the best, and my way is literally no way. My way is saying everybody gets to live their own lives as they choose, so long as they don't violently coerce other people against their will, so long as they don't use law or authority to mask their immorality. Okay, because people are always going to be immoral, but they don't need to be given power. And that's what we do when we create these systems of government. That's a philosophy, an understanding of the nature of these systems, which most people are at the very surface level just going to say, well, assumptions. Okay, what about this, and what about that, and what if not about this, and what if not about that? So they don't look at the underlying higher truths. Again, looking even more. They don't have an underlying principle. Their principle is what they were taught and indoctrinated within school, which is the system works as the way it is, and oh, well, there's no way to fix it. Where's the faith? And then you wonder why people go toward religions and they're super passionate about it, because most of them are voluntary. If you think about it, a government kind of works like a religion, except the religion is just a voluntary form of government, and government is a coercive, violent form of religion. It has its own holy text, it has its people to worship if you want change, and religion has all those things which you can have criticisms of, but they're not necessarily violently imposing their will on you, unless of course the church merges with the state, which it has done throughout history with Constantine and many other scenarios. You can look up the laterdayliberator.com. He documents this very deeply and very well. William Douglas, which is my friend who's also collaborating with our next project, The Liberator 2. Check it out if you care about freedom. But when people, say politics my way is best, they always forget about the other person. Again, it's not reciprocal. And that's an inconsistency in principle. Saying, well, I think this is the best way, but what if somebody else thinks there's another way that's also great? This is a contradiction. They say, oh, well, yeah, you should follow your individual conscience. But then they say, well, you need to follow this because I think it's right. It's like, well, what if somebody doesn't think it's right? We're going to talk about moral relativism later because that is also a contradiction some people may have or some people may see because of the faulty perspective. The perspective that isn't so aligned to another person's perspective, therefore making it inconsistent. If I'm sounding confusing in this video, I would encourage you to rewatch it. But consumerism and materialism is one of the most important ones, which I think is probably the easier one to understand. And it's the idea that it's like, yes, life is gentle, happiness, care, these things are beautiful things, but yet we somehow mask it and say we need these other things, and then we end up with this insatiable greed for more of those things. And we start to grow inconsistent, not just with ourselves, but with our nature and even what we say and what we say we want. And so we'll think that we are going to be happy by buying certain things, but when we don't actually end up happy. And that's likely because we don't know how those things are affecting us. We don't know what things we are consuming, and because we don't know what to consume, then we might end up making everything that is consumed the problem. But all consumerism is not the problem, because you're always going to be consuming something. You're always going to be taking something. The question is, what are you taking? What are you consuming? And if you're consuming something that is so natural for you to consume, you may not even consider it consumerism. If you're controlling something that is so natural to control, you wouldn't even call it control. I mean, this would just be part of life. And we live in the world where we question every little aspect of this world because everything is being challenged. Because everything is being violated, everything to the deepest level, often because of unnatural aggregates. Now, when I say unnatural, let me just make this very clear. The natural is what has always existed. And if you were to look at natural effects, which is a very important part of this, it would be that which gives to or supports the natural. Okay? And if you were to look at the unnatural, it doesn't really exist. It's an illusion. It's something that has to be man-made, because everything man-made is something that's taken from nature. Okay? Now, just because something is man-made does not make it unnatural by default. Okay? Because there are things we're always going to create. The question is, do we know if it affects our nature? How does it affect our nature? This will reflect upon if it will create natural effects. That being if it gives to or supports our nature versus unnatural effects, or what you may call denaturing, which is something that steals from or violates the natural. Okay? So notice that any wrong action is a form of theft in this case. And theft is violation, violence as well. Okay? Whereas if you are to do good, you are benefiting. Okay, you are giving to or supporting. And even if you were to steal nothing and you weren't to even give to someone, you are giving to them by not taking from them. If something belongs with them, of course. So you are actually helping someone by letting them be. In the case of Taoism or Stoicism, this becomes very evident that if you let things be, they turn out better, or they turn out the way they should be. And we can see this also in fasting and diet. Okay, but again, you're going to have some inconsistency in principle if people don't see the bigger consistency of principle. That being the time and place. That being, where does control go and where does it not? If you set your principle to a very limited, small world view, your principle is not going to be very consistent. But if you set it to a very grand worldview, that of which is encompassing many natures, then it will grow to be more consistent. And that goal is to be more accurate, because the more whole you look at something, the more health you have understood. Health means whole. That's what it means. To be a doctor, to be a teacher, same thing is to learn from that whole. So, being that we're learning from the whole, we consider ourselves philosophers or teachers or doctors or physicians or what have you, coaches, guides. Okay, we have to learn from that whole so we can apply a whole worldview for ourselves if we want to know the best of what we should do in this whole world and our whole life. Okay, not just bits and pieces. If we want to have direction, we have to be clear that when we're going on this direction, we might get off track, but we want to stay on track. And that track has to go through many different paths all throughout this whole. So you need to be able to understand where you're traveling within that whole. And if you understand the whole, it'll be very easy for you to know to travel. For instance, let's say you know the map of your entire state, which nobody really does, because it probably is too much, but nonetheless it's a good analogy. If you know your general area, you know where you can go, you know the area, and therefore you're never lost because you have direction, you know the area. Okay, now this is again having consistency. You know where to go. There is no inconsistency. There is no contradiction. But now we can talk about diet, which is also another important thing. People say this diet is best, this diet is best. And people say, well, we want a more natural diet. And we think maybe it's a vegan diet, or maybe we think it's a carnivore diet. But then even these can be inconsistent if they don't take a wider, huger, bigger worldview, right? Where they say, okay, if I'm cooking the food, that's separate from all diet. If it's being poisoned with chemicals, it's being grown or raised a certain way, that's different from diet. You know, if my body's digesting it, that's different from diet. Diet is only looking at the foods. It's not looking at you or the environment. Now maybe there is a diet that's based on that. Okay, wow, now it's a more holistic diet. But it's not the diet that most people refer to when they say the word diet. Nonetheless, that would make it more holistic. Yes, indeed. Okay, but that's where we have to find out. Again, is there contradiction within our thinking, within our actions, within our emotions, etc.? And having that unity is that self-mastery, is that sovereignty, is that freedom within yourself. I did that video on order and temperance and humility because that is all the matter of balance so much as it is polarity and being able to look at the bigger picture. It has exactly to do with what I'm talking about in this video. You know, let's say you're carnivore, you're eating a bunch of animals. If you don't see any reciprocal relationship between you and animals, that's a problem. Just as a vegan would have a problem if they don't see a reciprocal nature between them and their environment. There's reciprocity to be found everywhere within nature. And eating meat, eating plants, these things you can say are both very much natural as they've been consumed for thousands of years. And because they've been consumed for so long, it's harder for humanity to recognize what they should actually do. Okay, it's less of a gray area, but definitely we see there's benefits, and the natural effects are going to give us more conflicts because people are going to think, oh, well, this is beneficial for us. And we got to make sure that we're not lying to ourselves, that we're not contradicting or being inconsistent with ourselves when we make these statements. Because it's possible that when we support a certain government or when we support a certain diet or what have you, a religion of any kind, that we are contradicting ourselves. And that just requires a lot of self-evaluation. If we look at a pet's diet, you know, we say, man, we want this pet to be healthy, but then we never consider the fact of the natural environment they are supposed to be in. We never consider the wild, okay? Now, again, you don't have to agree with the whole idea of pets. I think that's a separate scenario. But pets within itself, if you don't give them the natural environments and the natural things that support them, they're not going to be happy, they're not going to be healthy. You're going to be able to see that. And so for somebody to say, oh, well, this product must be healthy because it was developed for this, but they never ask themselves what that pet would eat in the wild, that's a contradiction of principle if they care about nature, if they care about what is natural. And if they care about what is natural, and that's why they're buying some product that says it's natural, do they still understand what is natural? And this is where moral relativism comes in. Another way you can say it is authority relativism, because are you placing your authority in man, or are you placing it in nature or God? Because if you placed it in nature, then you wouldn't care what's on the package, you wouldn't care what some expert tells you, you wouldn't care what some governor or law tells you to do. You would care to look into the world for yourself and find out what you should do. But isn't this interesting? Here's an inconsistency or a contradiction that some people might see. If you're thinking for yourself, then that's relativism, because you are deciding for yourself what is right and wrong and what is natural and unnatural. So being sovereign or having an individual conscience is moral relativism. But this is where you need context, because otherwise, there's going to be inconsistency if you can't see the bigger picture. Some people are going to criticize moral relativism, particularly because of where you're placing that authority, like I'm saying. This is why I say natural versus unnatural as being more important than right versus wrong, even though it's essentially the same thing. I'm still distinguishing the difference between the two. But recognizing that when you think for yourself, you are putting thinking where it should be, yourself. Whereas if you were to think for somebody else, you're not putting thinking where it should be for somebody else. They can only think for themselves. They can only heal themselves. You can help them, you can guide them, but you can't impose your will on them, and that's what governments do today. That's what all so-called authority does today. There is no such thing as authority inherent in human beings. All human beings are just human beings, right? There is no thing in nature that says this person must wear a crown, they must have this title, they must be obeyed. That's all something that they made up and make you believe that you should follow that system. And that is entirely based on their whim and their opinion, and that's what most people talk about when they talk about moral relativism, the fact that there is no good or bad, and that man can just do whatever they want, but that means that man completely disregards nature. So I'm saying people should still think for themselves, but they should not disregard nature. That's understanding time and place, of knowing, yes, I have to think for myself, and I cannot decide, thinking for others. So that is a principle you can apply, time and place, right? The idea of, there's always a time and a place for everything. This is a common phrase that a lot of people say. And, the God versus state, I think, I talked about this before, but it's a very important thing because this too is a contradiction that people have. They say, I'm religious, I believe in God, Jesus is king, they'll even say. But yet they'll still support governments and actual man being kings, as if you think they were given the right by God to rule when they're doing things that you don't like or don't support. But then you think, maybe God made it so that these people, no, they're just people. They're not any more than just people. This is something, the whole reason why our founding fathers in America revolted against the British. It's bro, we're done with royalty. We're done with kings and queens. But it didn't help because they still have, and this is a contradiction they have within themselves, the idea that there's such a thing as authority vested in human beings, that God created a constitution or a piece of paper. No, he didn't. God didn't create that piece of paper. God created nature, created the natural world. God created anarchy, a free world which has no rulers. Man proclaims to say, we need to be the ruler. We need to have rulers. When God says, no, here's nature, here's the laws, those are rules. You don't need rulers, you rule yourself. That's your ruler, yourself. And if you don't rule yourself, that's slavery. That's it. That's why we ended slavery in the 1800s, because there's the government of God above that of the government of man. The abolitionists said it themselves, but this is insignificant and this doesn't matter to the person who wants to remain inconsistent in their principle, to the person who wants to remain ignorant, because that would cause somebody to want to be inconsistent or not see their inconsistencies, is saying, I refuse to see the knowledge. I refuse to see if I may be inconsistent. I refuse to see if there is a time and place. I refuse to see that there is some, a time where I can do this or a time where I can do that. Or they refuse to see that. And then you may say, Corey, aren't you contradicting yourself when you say you want anarchy, which means you refuse to see any position of government? That's because government isn't natural. Just as slavery isn't natural, it's completely an illusion. It's a man-made institution, completely on its face. God did not make you a slave. God did not make you under government. Man makes you under government. This is why they have to put you through so much indoctrination the minute you're born into this world, and not to mention, but the tons of vaccines that they give you. And this is an issue because this gets you into the world, and plus all the material things in the advertisements and the man-made religions and the man-made law, you get wrapped in the man-made currency, you get wrapped in the man-made world. This goes way past morality. For people to talk about moral relativism, it's honestly laughable when you can see there's actually value in people thinking for themselves as long as they understand the authority and where it's placed. And that will determine then their rules and how they interpret rules. A lot of people today think rules have to come from rulers, as if there are no natural laws like gravity in existence. There's rules like we have to follow all the time. If we don't cooperate with our fellow man, they're going to see us as chaotic and they're not going to like us very much. We're not going to love each other and we're not going to live in peace. We're not going to have anything good. Okay? That's the law of nature telling us that. That's health telling us that. That's not some politician, some written law telling us that. The written law doesn't change morality. All it says is dictates or says what already exists. It's basically irrelevant either way. It's like, oh, well, you are free. It's like, thanks, piece of paper. I don't really need the piece of paper to tell me something that naturally exists. And then it says, oh, you're not free. Well, it's like, okay, piece of paper. Well, you're just a piece of paper, so you're telling me I'm not free, but that's irrelevant because by nature I'm free. So either way, man's authority and man's government is not necessary or natural or moral in any which way possible. And if you think it is, please, please, please provide me the case. Show me my own contradictions. I want to see. Because often I will see contradictions within the people I talk to, the people that support government, the people that support the idea that man has authority, the people that support politics, the people that support surgeries that are completely unnecessary, the people that support man-made food and cooking, which is not necessary. The people who say those things are necessary because they have some principle, yet they're inconsistent with nature and their own understanding of reality, I want to see, can you see contradictions within myself or my own philosophy? Because that would interest me so I can get out of my own ignorance. If ignorance is the only evil, help me do so. I will help you as well. We all help each other when we all ask each other questions to hold each other accountable for our own consistency. And that is what allows us to be more honest if we are honest upright, if we start to be honest. That's why I wrote my whole book on radical honesty. It is the path toward truth, it is the path toward sharing truth, and that's why I make videos like this. Because I like to be honest with you, when I see there's contradictions in many places of the world, I'm going to spot them out, I'm going to say what they are. It's very controversial for me to say nails are unnatural for women, or their breast enlargement, or their hair color, or whatever, what have you. There's tons of examples. Makeup, tattoos, piercings. Not that these things necessarily affect someone's nature a ton. People should have knowledge as to what it's affecting. But it's their attachment to it that makes it ultimately dangerous. As Buddhism or other philosophies have said about attachment, it presumes that man can override nature or disregard it and do whatever they want with it. But tread carefully in this life, because life is gentle. You may think life is tough, and that's why we got to take it up on ourselves. But how much are you going to take it out on yourself? Because once life gets really tough, you see why people commit suicide, and I don't like that. I don't like the fact that people will take it out on their nature when their nature can sustain so much, can do so much, when they give it the potential to do so much. Their nature is in the capacity to grow, to live abundantly, to have the world at their fingertips, really have it under control. But that's because they're working with it and not against it. See, it's ironic, this is a contradiction, but it isn't a contradiction, it's actually consistent from a macro worldview, to say that you can control nature so long as you understand what you are controlling. And that's such a grounded principle that it may be actually too complex for the modern person, which is why they don't have that as their principle and they'd rather follow religions, because it's so simple to just be doing what other people tell you to do and what you were born into doing. But I want you to inquire into the world that you live in and look past those veils, look past those illusions and what people simply say of what you should do. I'm never to tell you what you should do. That's what governments do. I'm here to get you to think. All I can get you to do is think, as Socrates would say. And I use this quote so often because they help us with our consistency. He created the Socratic Method because they help us with our consistency and understanding if we have contradictions. We contradict our pets, we contradict our bodies and what we give ourselves with our food. We contradict ourselves with the material things, we contradict ourselves with our social life and politics. We contradict ourselves with titles and identities. We contradict ourselves with courses and things that we buy, that we put our money into. All of it that I talked about in this video with our beliefs and other versus other beliefs and how we put them out into the world. That's all the matter of self-evaluation, which is why Eastern medicine is on the rise, which is why Eastern philosophy is on the rise, and which is why these ideas of natural law are only bound to grow. It has always grown throughout the ages, but now we have mass information at our fingertips. We have the ability to reach the masses. Mass enlightenment is now a possibility, and that should greatly inspire you, because when you have the possibility to educate the public in mass, that means you have the guaranteed outcome of freedom. If many of the people of the past said, well, education is the path to freedom, but we don't have a printing press, we don't have the ability to get the knowledge out there, our books burnt down, our churches burnt down, these people invaded our space, how are we going to get the ideas out there? And now you may have censorship, but what's going to stop a decentralized internet? What's going to stop millions of people going at it? What's going to stop you from speaking your voice? It's your nature, it's your soul they'd have to destroy. And it's ultimately you who has to uphold your own soul, your own conscience, your own life. And so I hope you do, because it was given to you. And are you going to do nothing with it? Are you going to distract yourself with it? Are you going to attach yourself to things that aren't going to truly fulfill you or the natural world? Because if you're going to be consistent in keeping up with what you were given, then you will maintain what you have and actually make it even better as time moves on, not worse. People age into this world and they deteriorate over time, and their brain gets worse and their wisdom goes away. And then other people, they gain a huge sense of ego, thinking that they're the greatest thing on the face of this earth. Right? But you don't have to be either one of those. You don't have to degrade yourself or put yourself above huge standards. You can have a sense of humility, order, balance within your life to understand these worldviews and take a step back. And you might just be higher by being lower, but you simply are yourself, and you don't care about higher or lower or more or less. You don't care about time, you don't care about money. You live your life accordingly to what needs to be done and what has to be done, and that is the destiny for humanity. That is understanding what is natural and what is nature. Thank you very much for watching. This is Corey Angelot. Nature is the answer.